So today's talk by Dr. Battram is about the benefits of consuming water and the problem with sugar-sweetened beverages. So we really look forward to that presentation. But just before we begin that, I'm going to give you a quick overview of Healthy Weights Connection. So Healthy Weights Connection strives to improve and coordinate existing community resources and access new resources to achieve and maintain healthy weights among Aboriginal children and youth. One of our goals is to increase awareness of local services, of Aboriginal culture and people, and improve partnerships among the organizations that serve First Nations and Métis children and families. Healthy Weights Connection currently operates in the areas of London, Midland, Penetanguishene, and in the Niagara region in Ontario. And on each of these sites, we have a site coordinator working to build and nurture partnerships with and between local community partners. The site coordinators in these communities are hosted at the Namarn Friendship Centre in London, the Métis Nation of Ontario in Midland, and the Niagara Regional Native Centre in Niagara-on-the-Lake. So I know that we have Alyssa from London on the call this morning, so thanks Alyssa for joining us. We also have our site coordinator Lenora, who's in Niagara, and Jody, who had been our site coordinator in Midland. So that's just sort of a brief overview of Healthy Weights Connection. But now I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Danielle Battram, and she's an associate professor and registered dietitian at the School of Food and Nutritional Sciences at Brescia University College. Her research focuses mainly on obesity prevention in children and adults, and her approach to nutrition is a holistic one in which she promotes whole foods, food literacy, and overall diet quality. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm now going to pass the presentation on to Danielle. So Danielle, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dana. Good morning, everyone, and again, thank you for letting me come and talk to you today about water and why it actually does wonders. And I'm quite happy with that tagline. So thank you for letting me talk about this once again, and to expand my talk that I gave previously on sweetened beverages as well. I wanted to start with the importance of hydration and why it's so important that we're hydrated. I always say that water is actually the unappreciated nutrient. It's not one that we discuss very often, although we acknowledge the fact that it's extremely important. You may or may not know that the majority of our body is actually made up of water, up to about 75%, depending on, of course, where we are in the lifespan. We also know that water tends to follow our muscles. So as we age and we lose a little bit of that lean mass, we actually do lose a little bit of water, but it still actually makes up the bulk of what we do. 2/3 of the water is actually kept within our cells and will play a very important role as we go to the next slide, as we'll see. But the remaining third is actually in our blood, it's around our cells, and it's part of the digestive juices that we use to help to actually process our foods. If we actually look at why water is actually so critical for life, we know that it's involved in all of the chemical reactions in the body. It is the medium in which we conduct all things in the body, and this is really what makes it so very critical to us. It really is responsible for dissolving and transporting almost everything in our body, from the oxygen that we consume, from the nutrients that we need to nourish ourselves, but also to get rid of waste. And I think that's something that we sometimes forget. We need to expel carbon dioxide, and we need to get rid of some of these other wastes in our body. Nitrogen, for example, from protein or extra protein. So it's very important that we use that transport system in order to maintain our health. The other thing that water does is it also contributes to our blood volume. And that is really crucial in terms of keeping our blood pressure healthy and at a stable level. So maintaining that blood volume is very important. It's also very critical in cooling our bodies and maintaining our body temperature, and we've certainly needed that with the summer we've just had here in Ontario. But this whole idea that heat can travel in the water in our blood, be transported to the surface, and then allow for that evaporation of the heat through sweat, and that cooled blood can then go to our core and cool us down. This is extremely important, and it is a major function of water in our bodies. And I think the other thing that we know about and think about is that it protects and actually lubricates our tissues, such as our bones and our brains. So if we think of the cerebral spinal fluid, you know, the fluid that cushions our brains and our vertebrae, as well as, you know, synovial fluid that's around our joints. We also have to think about saliva in our mouths. You know, when we chew, we use that saliva to lubricate, and mucus to lubricate food through the digestive system. And I think we've all experienced what happens if we don't chew enough and we swallow something that's a little harsh, as the chip in the throat kind of scenario. So this certainly is also a major function of fluid in our bodies. So how do we maintain this water balance in our bodies? No doubt, we call it an essential nutrient because we need to get it from food and from liquid. And that's really where we get the majority of the water in our bodies or into our bodies. What you might not know, however, is that we actually do produce a little bit of water in the body. It's about 1 cup, so it's not enough to sustain us. We definitely need to get fluid through food and through liquids. But we do actually have the capacity in our bodies to make a little bit of water through chemical reactions. On the water outside, no doubt, urine and sweat, that's where we expel the most of our water. We do lose a little bit in the feces, although the colon's major job is to try to absorb as much water as it can. And we expel through our lungs as well. So all in all, we really have a total of about 1,500 to 2,800 mils per day that we're controlling in terms of this balance. So what happens to us, however, when we don't get enough water? We know that dehydration can happen quite quickly, actually. So mild dehydration, again, is defined as kind of less than 5% loss of body weight. It's things like thirst and dry mouth. You might have a little bit of lack of energy, concentrated urine. Certainly fainting can result if you get close to that 5% mark. We do know, however, that even with a little bit of dehydration, we can see effects. So as little as 1%, you can actually have loss of concentration. So our bodies are very in tune to being aware of dehydration. Obviously, if we let it go and continue along that path, it will get more severe. And one of the major problems that happens is that effect on blood volume, which then affects heart rate and can actually lead to some shock, coma, or death. But we definitely have a lot of warning signs to tell us when we actually need to drink, and thirst is certainly one of them. So we've kind of talked about why water is important and what happens when we get dehydrated, but let's talk about fluid and actually how much we need and how exactly are we doing as Canadians. Right now, the recommendation, we have an adequate intake level, which basically means that we don't have great solid evidence to actually narrow in on a very close target, but we do have some recommendations. It's also important to point out that when we're talking about the adequate intake level, we're talking about total water. And so that's water from all sources. It's not just fluid. So we have to keep in mind that moisture from food actually does contribute to our fluid intake. And so what I'm going to be talking about a little bit is total water at this time, and then we'll kind of go in and branch into fluid on its own and talk about sources. So how much should we get? Now this is the actual numbers for those of you who like to have the concrete numbers. So this is just basically looking at all of the different age and gender groups to see how much we need. Not surprising, as we grow and as we gain body mass and we gain cells, we obviously are going to need to have more water because of all those cells containing water and the mass that we have. So certainly we see that increase over our lifespan. If you're more into cups, it's basically the same slide that I just presented in table format is now in figure format, so it's a little bit easier maybe to comprehend. And we can see here that when we look at boys, and I should say men as well, and girls and women, that we can see that that increases over time to the point where, you know, adults actually need about 15 to 10 cups or 10 to 15 cups of total fluid. So that's total, not just fluid, but total water in a day. So how are we actually doing? And again, this is for people who actually like the numbers, and we'll get into a couple of figures in the next few slides. But this is basically looking at the numbers, and it's in milliliters this time instead of liters. So the AI is in milliliters. So if we look at, let's say, both genders age 1 to 3 years, the AI is 1,300 milliliters or 1.3 liters. And we can see that on average, Canadian children about this age are getting about 1,400. So when we go down the list, without going through all the numbers individually, what we can see is we're not doing too badly in terms of actually meeting our requirement, our estimated requirement, but there's certainly room for improvement. And we can see that the gap between what we need and what we're getting tends to be a little bit greater in men. So certainly this is an area that we can target. This is just, again, another way of looking at things if you prefer figures. And you can see if we look at the actual versus the recommended, so the AI is the recommended, and then the actual figures, we can see again that we're not doing too badly, but again, there is always room for a little bit of improvement, particularly when we're talking about boys and men. So what happens if we actually look at what kind of beverages we're actually drinking? And I have to say that the majority of this data is actually coming from 2004, and I'm very sorry that I'm presenting this data, but I don't have the new stuff yet. The CCHS has actually conducted its last survey in 2015, and so we're expecting that data to come out. So I just always like to say that so we're aware that this is 2004 data that was published in 2008. So we will be waiting for the new stuff to come. But basically what this is showing us is what children are drinking in terms of their beverage patterns. You can see there the total beverage, and then we've broken it up into what exactly they're drinking. 85% of children and teens, in terms of their beverage intake, is actually in 5 categories. So they drink water, milk, fruit juice, and sugary beverage. And the sugary beverage that I'm referring to is actually soft drinks and fruit drinks. I've actually collapsed them together, but those are actually the 2 main sources. I think it's also important in this data, no coffee type beverages or energy drinks was included, which in 2004 might have made some sense, but now in 2016 does not. So I'm happy to report that the new survey will actually include that data, and I would expect that as we go up in the lifespan, so adolescents in particular, we're going to see a lot of those coffee type beverages, although the energy drinks, we know that most adolescents, only about 10% are consuming them. So this data is going to look very different for us, I think, next time around. But what we do know is that those are really the primary sources of beverages in a child or teen's diet. On a typical day, we've got about 70% of children that are consuming water regularly. So that's on a daily basis, which means that 30% are not, which again signals to me that there's a little bit of room for improvement. If we actually look at the data and look at what children are actually consuming, what we'll see is that as we move through the lifespan, things actually change for us. So when we're younger, the majority of our beverages are coming from milk, and that's not really surprising given the dietary guidelines and the recommendations. Water makes up a little bit, fruit juice starts to enter, but SSBs or sweetened beverages don't really contribute a lot. As we move up in years, however, we see and start to see this shift happen where water and milk start to shift a bit. We're drinking more water, a little bit less milk. But look what happens to the sweetened beverage. Fruit juice remains relatively stable, but it's the sweetened beverage that gets introduced. And if we start to look at what's going on in the child's life and the transition that's happening is that I think they're going to school. And so instead of getting milk, which we do know there's a lot of great milk programs out there, but not all kids are partaking, and what we're seeing is drink boxes. And so we're seeing fruit drinks being added here. So we can see this shift happening. Water and milk actually contribute about 68% to the beverage intake of children in this age, or at the younger age, and that seems to drop a little bit as they grow. This also changes when we start to get into the youth and the adolescent years. And again, we can see that there's another shift. Milk consumption goes down, and we start to see a little bit more sweetened beverage be consumed. And so again, I always say adolescence is a very challenging period, and it's certainly an area where we need to do a little bit more work. We see that sweetened beverages only contributes about 14% to beverage intake in young children, but that goes up to almost 40% in adolescents. So this is definitely another group that I think we need to target. So what happens, you know, in the literature, and what happens when we actually ask people to drink more water? What actually happens in the diet? And this was a great study done by Anderson very recently. And basically what he did was he took overweight adolescents and assigned them for 12 weeks to drink 1 liter per day of one of the following. So either 1 liter to keep their diet exactly the way it was. He wanted it to be very organic. And so basically all that changed was what group or what liter of fluid basically they were consuming. And I think the thing that was awesome about the results of this study was that all groups actually decreased the consumption of some convenience foods. And those convenience foods are those other foods that we know are high in sugar, salt, and fat. And in that other foods was actually a decrease in sweetened beverage. And so that was very, very encouraging, almost to the point of 1 liter per week, which basically equates to about 500 calories. So just asking people to drink 1 liter of fluid actually resulted in a decrease in calories. And what we know is that sometimes thirst can actually be mistaken for hunger. And so it's one of the weight loss strategies that we use as dietitians to say, you know, if you're feeling a little bit hungry and you don't really think you should be because maybe you ate lunch, you know, an hour before, try drinking something, because it could actually be that you're thirsty. And so just by asking people to drink more water, what we see is they consume actually fewer calories and they actually consume less sweetened beverage. So it's a great strategy for us moving forward, I think, in terms of helping with hydration as well as potentially weight maintenance and weight loss. The other thing that's a great opportunity, and I can't help mentioning fruits and vegetables as a dietitian, but we know that they're very important. And I think we can use this opportunity if we're going to promote hydration, to promote fruits and vegetables. Most of them have 80% or more of water. However, we do know that the dried varieties are not included here. However, we do know that they contain a lot of water and they have a lot of variety and they're fun and they can be put into water. And so I think it's a great opportunity for us to actually start promoting fruits and vegetables at the exact same time as water. So that's an exciting angle that I know here in London we're looking at. So if we leave water behind for a second and start talking about sugar-sweetened beverages, I have to be honest, when I started putting this part of the presentation together, it was a little challenging, even for an academic in the area, because there's so much information and there's so much conflicting information. And so it was a little challenging to try to put this together. So I hope that I can lead you through a lot of evidence and a lot of information and kind of get to the core, I think, of the story. And where I always start is the beginning, and this is where I think it all kind of began. If we look at what happened in the 1970s and 80s, fat really became our focus in terms of managing weight and obesity. We knew obesity rates were starting to climb, we had increases in heart disease, and really fat got targeted mainly because it has more calories per gram than carbohydrate or protein. And unfortunately what happened is this led to a low-fat movement, which was not necessarily a bad thing, but had some really unfortunate unintended consequences. And so things like trans fat got introduced. And I think one of the biggest detriments that happened was that we kind of lost sight of talking about other nutrients. It was kind of like if you ate low fat, then everything would be fine, and don't worry about carb, and don't worry about sugar or anything else. Just eat low fat and you'll be okay. And what ended up happening, of course, is that carbohydrate basically became this benign nutrient, and it's not. And what we saw, and what the graph shows you on the left-hand side here, is that as we took in more sugar, we saw that the obesity rates continued to climb at the same time. So there was this positive association between consuming sugar and obesity. So here we've got low fat and obesity still going up. So we think, well, it can't be the fat, so what are we going to target next? And really carbohydrate was the target. What was kind of lost as well is that what we found, and then I apologize that the graph is so small, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a indication of what happened during that time, is that we started eating more. So the fat properties in food changed. We started adding more, sometimes calories, to things. And basically what we saw was that the American diet, if you look at or compare it to the 1970s to now, we're consuming about 400 calories more than we used to. And so that actually became very problematic. But really what happened was sugar became our focus, carbs became our focus. And we've kind of moved on from there. In terms of the current recommendations surrounding sugar, and I'll move exclusively to sugar now, there's really no consensus. The Institute of Medicine, which is basically responsible for setting the dietary reference intakes that we use as dietitians, basically said that if you keep sugar or added sugar, which is very important here, so added sugar is sugar not intrinsic to a food, basically, if you keep that under 25% of your total energy intake, then you'll probably be okay. What that means is that you probably won't displace a lot of nutrients in the diet and be unhealthy. Not a great standard, but it was really the best that they had at the time. Of course, we have much more information now, but it is under 25% of added sugar. WHO has been far more aggressive and definitely has been taking a lot of stances recently in the media, and they're recommending less than 10% of calories from free sugars. And so this is where the definitions get a little complicated, but free sugars is actually referring to any monosaccharide, so that's things like glucose and fructose, and any disaccharide, so that's things like sucrose, which basically is made up of glucose and fructose. But those two things that are added to foods or drinks by manufacturers, by cooking, by the consumer, and they also included sugars from naturally occurring sources, so things like syrups and honeys and things like that. What they did do, however, is they did remove milk and fruit from that category, so they did not include that when they were talking about their mono and disaccharides. So that's not included in their definition, but everything else is fair game. So under 10% is their recommendation. The recommendation is actually primarily made on dental carie evidence. However, there is a little bit of obesity evidence in there. So under 10% is recommended, and if you can get it under 5, then there may be some additional health benefits. So that's equates to about 6 teaspoons of sugar. So how are we doing as Canadians? This is interesting, is that we're consuming on average about 26 teaspoons of sugar. So we're definitely not meeting that 5% mark, but this is total sugar. And so I think that's a very important distinction. So this is 26 teaspoons of total sugar, not just added sugar. If we look at the percentage, it's about 21, 22% of our total energy. So we're definitely in line with what the Institute of Medicine is suggesting in terms of their recommendation. And we'll talk about how we're doing with respect to WHO in a second. I think what's very interesting is if you break that 21% down to where we're actually getting our sugars from, I think that's important. I'm proud to say that a third of it is actually coming from fruits and vegetables, so that wouldn't be included in WHO's recommendation. But I think I'm not proud to say that another third of it is coming from other foods. And so that's our cakes, our cookies, our confectionaries, and as we move into the Halloween season, we definitely know that that becomes more of an issue. If we look at the top 10 sources, that actually contributes up to 85% of our sugar intake. And so what exactly are those top 10 sources? And I apologize again if this is a little hard to see, but basically this was done by Health Canada in 2009 or 10, they published this data. But basically what it shows is if we look at the top 10 sources, so again, this is contributing primarily to our sugar intake, We can see that in young children, milk and fruit it really are the major contributors. Fruit juice comes in on a third. So that's something that we might want to consider doing. But the milk and fruit wouldn't be considered a problem, again, by WHO's definition. As, of course, we age, we can see that things like soft drinks start to take a really prominent role in contributing to our sugar intake. And so I think this is one area that we're going to look at, and as we go through the presentation, I'm going to focus a lot on that. So basically, this was a combination of Health Canada and the Canadian Sugar Institute that basically got together and tried to get an estimate of how much added sugar we're actually consuming. So we know that we're consuming about 21 there. And basically because the recommendations are based on added sugar and not total. And so what they did was they actually looked at the top 10 sources that I showed you in the previous slide for each age group. And they estimated how much added sugar would be contributing to each one of those foods. And what I've tried to do is give you the last line here. And the first number, that 22.8%, is the total sugar. The next one is the natural sugar, so the intrinsic sugar. And then the final number is the one we're most interested in, because that's telling us approximately how much added sugar is coming from those top 10 sources. And basically what we can see is that we're, for the most part, at least around or close to WHO's recommendation of that 10%. And so what this is telling us is, from a total sugar perspective or an added sugar perspective, as Canadians, we're not doing too badly. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement, and we're going to talk about that in the next few slides. But certainly, you know, it's one of those things is that we've got to be a little cautious about what exactly we're targeting, I think. So what about sugar and sugar-sweetened beverages, or SSBs? And I think that just to give some perspective on how this topic is still raging, is that at the latest Canadian Diabetes Association meeting, there was a debate between two researchers talking about you know, sugar being very harmful and sugar not being so harmful. And so I'm presenting some of the data that was just published recently from that debate. And this is from John Stephen Piper from Toronto. And basically he put together a paper in the Canadian Journal of Diabetes, and I've got the reference there if you'd like to see it in full. But I think what his argument is basically suggesting is we've kind of got to look at sugar and sweetened beverages and see which one is actually the biggest culprit. And what he's showing here in this diagram is basically showing us the association between sugar-containing foods and your risk of cardiometabolic diseases. So when we say that, we're talking about things like diabetes and heart disease. And anything to the right of the line there that you see, the red dots, anything to the right is harmful or increases your risk, whereas anything to the left basically is a benefit or no association. And what we can see is that really it's the sweetened beverages that I think that we have to be concerned about. It's not really total sugar in general or all added sugar. And if we look at things like yogurt, is there cereal, fruits definitely that have sugar. These things really aren't contributing a lot of harm, I think, to us in terms of cardiometabolic risk, but it seems to be these sweetened beverages that seems to be the problem. And I think this is an important distinction, is that we do have to remember that sugar actually has a lot of functionality in food. It can help us to eat Greek yogurt. That's very positive for our health. It's got a lot of protein and a lot of other good stuff in it. Also, I can't imagine eating my brand buds without a little bit of sugar in that product. So it's not that we have to classify all added sugar, I think, as negative, but there could be sources, and certainly sweetened beverages seems to be one that can be potentially harmful. So why are these beverages actually so detrimental potentially to our health? And I think it's really because that liquids can be consumed in such large volumes. That we can actually, you know, consume 500 mils of a lemonade or an iced tea on a hot day very, very quickly. That contributes a lot of calories to our diet. and that our body doesn't have to process at all. It's a liquid. It goes into the body, it gets absorbed. And so we actually don't have to do any processing as well. So we're not expending any energy to actually process. So we can actually consume a lot of calories in a short period of time. I think the other reason that sweetened beverages can be potentially more harmful is that we don't actually compensate for the energy we consume through a sweetened beverage later in the day. So what we know is that for those who do consume sweetened beverages, we know that it adds extra calories to the diet, calories you might not need. We know that if we include milk in the diet, that might actually control how many calories we consume later. But if we consume something like a Coke or a Pepsi or something, a soft drink of some kind, it's just added calories. So if you're consuming a lot of them, they can be contributing a lot of extra calories to the diet. So how are we doing in terms of beverage intake currently? What we're actually seeing is that we're actually seeing a decline in soft drink consumption, and this is being reported by the beverage industry as well. You'll notice that Pepsi just put out a press release saying that they're actually going to decrease the amount of calories in their beverages. Every serving is going to have, I think, under less than 100 calories. So that was a recent announcement by them. So we know that our public health messaging is doing well. That it's actually prompting industry to respond to consumer demand. So we actually do know that soft drink consumption is going down. What we also know, however, is that obesity rates, while I'm happy to report in Canada, are stable or declining just a tiny bit. There seems to be this disconnect, if you will, between how potent sweetened beverage actually is contributing to obesity. And so while I still think we have to be mindful of it, I think we also have to proceed with a little bit of caution. And what I mean by that is if we do actually look at how potent sweetened beverages is in contributing to our risk of disease, it actually falls behind a lot of other dietary factors. So this diagram is very similar to the one that I showed you before, except instead of risk of cardiometabolic disease, it's actually looking at risk of type 2 diabetes. And what we can see here is actually consuming one serving more of fried food or processed meat is actually more detrimental or more harmful to our risk of developing diabetes than even sweetened beverage. So again, this is telling us that while sweetened beverage is contributing certainly to our risk, it's not the only dietary factor that I think we need to consider. And I don't want to labor this point, but I'll get to the reason why I'm showing you all of this in a second. But another head-to-head risk assessment that looked at 67 risk factors for mortality and burden of disease has ranked sweetened beverages either 32nd globally or 19th in North America, which basically means that there's a lot of other things that are contributing more to mortality and to the burden of disease than only sweetened beverages. And I've listed some here for you. So things like being physically inactive is a major contributor to our burden of disease. Having a diet low in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds, all of these plant-based products, as well as having diets high in processed meats as well as sodium. So while sweetened beverage is certainly something that I think we want to put our eye to and be mindful of, it's not the only thing that I think that we need to be considering. So I know we're talking about hydration today, and we want to talk about promoting water and decreasing sweetened beverage, but I don't want us to lose sight that we still have to look at the totality of the diet. I'll leave you with this final thought from Frank Hu. He is actually a major obesity researcher in the United States. And I'll read from his paper is that while decreasing sweetened beverage consumption is certainly warranted due to our unlimited and easy access to these products, we should not lose sight of the diet in its totality. I think the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So while I fully support action taken against sweetened beverage, I think we don't want sweetened beverage to become our next fad. I think if we do that, then we're going to have these other unintended consequences and be right back where we started from. So I think it's very important that we still take a comprehensive approach to the diet, and that's where the fruits and vegetable idea and water is so exciting, is that we can actually promote a lot of other foods while at the same time promoting hydration. So if we go back to hydration for a second, what can we do to get children to see what they say? And we've published 2 studies now where we did focus groups in children and adolescents and asked them about sweetened beverage as well as caffeine and caffeine containing beverages. And basically this is what we found, is that, you know, awareness regarding water as a healthy beverage is generally really high. People know that water and milk is good for them. Fruit juice tends to sometimes get a little muddy, particularly in children. But I think we can still promote other aspects of hydration. And one of the things that I found very intriguing with adolescents is that they said, you know, I drink coffee because I need energy. And I think it's something where we could promote water will give you energy and help you stay focused and things like that. So I think our messaging has to change maybe a little bit, or be a little bit more comprehensive. When we look at the influences, taste and preference are always going to be the thing that we look to decide what we eat and what we drink. And I think you know, the beverage industry has definitely done a great job at promoting a lot of their products. Relaxation of sweetened beverages might be you know, a viable option for us. I think we also have to be mindful of the fact that we have to have an alternative that's equally as good. And if we don't know what people will turn to alternatively. So we're going to have to make sure that things like waters and other things are going to taste good and be just as appealing to children and adolescents in particular. Parental control practices and role modeling were also very important with respect to children and teens. Obviously, control practices are a little bit more influential in younger children, so controlling how much pop or what types of beverages are actually consumed and when they can be consumed. The role modeling is very interesting in adolescents, because we had a lot of adolescents tell us that they drink more coffee because mom or dad stops at Tim Hortons or Starbucks on the way to work and they're in the car, and so they get one too. So I think moving forward, if we're going to be doing any kind of education, parents still need to be included and still need to understand that the roles that they play in their children's and teens actually beverage selection. Accessibility is always going to be a thing. Certainly advertising is always going to be something that we're faced with. I think media literacy is going to be where we need to go. We need to make children and teens understand that these companies are trying to sell us something, that drinking Gatorade will not automatically make you play hockey like Sid Crosby. And so I think teens seem to understand this a little bit more, but still are bought in to the ideas of advertising. And so I think media literacy should be included in all education. Peer social norms, image enhancement, these are very important to children and teens, and it's something that I think we need to consider. You know, going out and having a coffee or getting a Starbucks and going to the mall is something that teen girls mention to us that they just do. It's just something that's part of their culture. And so I think we're going to have to try to make other things more acceptable, and doing things for health. Children and teens, they're aware of things that are healthy, and so I think we can still try to promote that messaging as well. So hopefully this data will help to support some education that maybe some of you are thinking of doing. I wanted to leave you with a few things that we're suggesting. I'm part of another initiative through the HKCC grant, and basically we've come up with kind of some standards that we're thinking about, and I've given you the taglines that you may or may not choose to use, but drinking water first, and water actually does do wonders. This whole idea that sweetened beverages only adds calories and sugar, and that sports beverages are not for most of us, but you know, they really were only formulated for athletes, and I think you'll see that Gatorade is actually moving their advertising more towards that. And so I think promoting water first is our best option. Also, keep drinking. Thirst is not a good indicator of hydration. If you're already got a dry mouth or feeling thirsty, you're already dehydrated. So making sure that you have it accessible at all times, that you can see it. I love when I talk about hydration in my lectures because you automatically see everybody drink. So certainly you can set your Fitbit watch, whatever it is you need to do, but to keep drinking and make sure that you always have something accessible. We tend to drink more when water's cold as well, so that's something to consider if you're going to be offering beverages to kids, and to keep it fun. We certainly need to be coming up with ideas to make these water beverages more appealing to kids, whether it's adding mint, whether it's adding lemons, whether it's these infusers, whatever we can do to try to make it fun and interesting, so that it becomes their preference. And I stole this last one from Andrew Fleet, from Growing Chefs, and he basically has come up with this tagline: is "Did you eat your water today?" And again, it's my plug again for the fruits and vegetables, and trying to promote the intake of them, so that we can actually help with hydration at the same time. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and I'll certainly field any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for your thought-provoking presentation. I really appreciate your holistic view on diets and water and sugar-sweetened beverages. And I really do think this presentation was a perfect complement to the Healthy Kids Community Challenge theme right now, that's going on in all 3 of the communities that we have been working with. So if anyone does have questions for Danielle, you can type them into the chat feature there on the bottom right. Maybe while people are thinking up some questions for you, Danielle, I'll start you off with an easy one. What's your favorite combination for some flavored water? What do you like to add to your water?
Unfortunately, I think I'm very boring. I like still lemon and lime, unfortunately. But I've certainly been intrigued about adding things like mint, and basil, so a little bit of herbs. So I've been trying that recently, and mint and strawberry is actually quite a nice one as well.
Yeah, I love mint and cucumber myself.
Oh, nice.
I also really like the idea of promoting the fruit and vegetable consumption at the same time as water, and eating your water for the day. That's a great one.
Yeah, I think the more we can try to be comprehensive, I think that's very important. I think because of the movement that happened with fat and this focus on a single nutrient, that the more we can be creative, um, I I think we need to do that. I think we need to be more comprehensive if we can, and to make sure that we don't go down that path of only looking at one thing.
Certainly. So we have a question here from Alyssa. She says, when should children under 1 year old start drinking water, and how much should they consume?
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have the exact number in front of me. I would have to go and look that up. I tend not to work with children that young. But certainly I know under 1 year of age, we're really concerned about making sure that kids get enough nutrients. So there's a balance here that has to be achieved, between making sure that kids are getting all the fluid they need as well as getting all the nutrients that they need. And so we do know that, recommendations in terms of breastfeeding, can go up to 1 to 2 years of age. So certainly a lot of fluid would come through breast milk. So I don't think that there's a large volume of water that's recommended under 1 year of age. But certainly a little bit would be okay. But there's a balance. Again, we don't want kids filling up on too much water or too much fluid. So I apologize that I don't have the exact number, but I certainly could get that to somebody if they wanted it. Hello?
Any other questions out there for Danielle? I know it's hard without a microphone to try to get your thoughts down in the chat very quickly. All right, it looks like that might be it for you, Danielle, for the questions. So thank you again so much, both you, Danielle, and for everyone else for joining us this morning. Again, the recording will be made available on our website, so if you have any colleagues who weren't able to make it this morning, you can share that link with them. And we do have other resources available on our website if you'd like to check those out, both related to water and other healthy eating and physical activity resources. So that website is www.healthyweightsconnection.ca, and I will just type that into the chat here. But if there aren't any other questions, I think we will wrap up for this morning. All right, looks like we don't have any more questions. So again, thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks, Danielle.
Great, thank you.